The wedding dress weighs more than she does. 6-year-old Isabelle of France can barely walk under the weight of golden silken jewels as hundreds of candles flicker against the Gothic windows of St. Paul's Cathedral. The organ thunders through the stone halls while nobles from 2 kingdoms watch a child bride approach the altar, where a 29-year-old man waits to make her his queen. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover the horrifying truth about Europe's youngest political victim. Evidence that medieval chroniclers tried to bury for centuries about what really happened behind palace walls when children became pawns in royal games. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. This wasn't some barbaric ancient practice from distant lands. This was London. This was France. This was the height of medieval civilization, and what I'm about to reveal will completely shatter your understanding of how European royalty treated their own children. November the 9th, 1389. The Louvre Palace echoes with screams, but not from childbirth. King Charles VI of France is having another episode. He's convinced he's made of glass, that a single touch will shatter him into 1,000 pieces. Palace guards have been ordered to stay back as the King of France cowers in corners, whimpering that invisible enemies are hunting him through his own halls. In another wing of the palace, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria gives birth to her 4th daughter. The midwives exchange worried glances. Another girl, another mouth to feed, another political tool to be sharpened and traded when the time comes. They name her Isabelle, and from her first breath she's not a child, she's currency. Think about that for a moment. While your biggest worry at 6 might have been learning to read or making friends, Isabelle was being groomed as a living treaty. Her toys weren't just dolls, they were miniature courts where she practiced diplomatic ceremonies. Her bedtime stories weren't fairy tales, they were lessons in statecraft. But to understand how a 6-year-old ended up married to a man old enough to be her father, we need to expose the rotting core of the French royal family. Charles VI, Charles the Mad, hadn't always been insane. At 24, something snapped in the king's mind during a military campaign. One moment he was leading his army, the next he was attacking his own men, convinced they were assassins. The episodes came in waves. Sometimes he'd be lucid for months, acting as the cultured king France needed. Then, without warning, he'd strip naked and run howling through the palace, or forget his own name, or worse, forget he had a wife and children at all. Medieval medicine had no answers. Physicians tried everything from bloodletting to exorcism. Nothing worked. France was ruled by a madman, and in the shadows, opportunists circled like vultures. Isabeau of Bavaria, Isabelle's mother, was the chief vulture. Where others saw tragedy in the king's madness, she saw opportunity. Every episode meant more power she could seize, more gold she could hoard, more lovers she could take while her husband cowered in his chambers. Wait, it gets worse. The court chroniclers, and remember, these were people paid to make royalty look good. They couldn't even hide their disgust. One wrote that Isabeau cared more for her jewels than her children, more for her pleasures than her prayers. Another claimed she had at least 3 lovers while the king suffered his episodes, sometimes entertaining them in rooms adjacent to where Charles VI was being restrained. This was the woman raising Isabelle. This was her model of motherhood. The Louvre Palace of Isabelle's childhood was a maze of conspiracies. 2 factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, fought for control of the Mad King. Assassination attempts were common. Poison was a constant fear. Noble children didn't play in gardens. They played in fortified courtyards with guards watching for crossbow bolts. Isabelle learned to recognize the signs of her father's approaching madness before she learned her letters. The way his eyes would dart around the room, the trembling in his hands, the sudden silence that meant everyone should evacuate before the violence began. She was 4 years old when she first saw her father try to kill her mother, convinced Isabeau was a demon sent to steal his soul. But here's the detail historians don't want you to know. The French court kept meticulous records of expenses, and hidden in those dusty ledgers is a heartbreaking entry. In 1394, when Isabelle was 5, the royal treasury paid for iron bars to be installed on the Princess Isabelle's chamber windows. Not for decoration, not for security against outside threats, but because a 5-year-old princess had tried to jump. Even at that age, death seemed preferable to the life she was living. The childhood trauma was just preparation for what was coming. In 1395, messengers arrived from England with a proposal that would solve many of France's problems and create a lifetime of nightmares for one little girl. Richard II of England was desperate. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died, leaving him without heirs and without allies. His nobles were restless. His treasury was empty from constant warfare with France. He needed peace, he needed money, and he needed them immediately. The French council saw an opportunity to buy nearly 30 years of peace with English gold, all for the price of one 6-year-old girl. The negotiations are where this story turns from tragic to truly monstrous. Imagine this: grown men in velvet robes sitting around mahogany tables, haggling over a child like merchants at a slave market. The English ambassadors initially balked at Isabel's age. Even by medieval standards, 6 was shockingly young. Most royal brides were at least 12, old enough to potentially survive childbirth. But the French negotiators had a counter-argument that should chill you to your core. They explained that taking Isabel young meant Richard could shape her to his preferences. She would grow up knowing only English customs, only Richard's desires. She would be, in their words, more completely his. They were talking about grooming, state-sanctioned, internationally negotiated grooming of a 6-year-old child. The English wanted to inspect her first. That's right, inspect her, like livestock. French courtiers were ordered to parade Isabel before the English delegation. They examined her teeth, her posture, her hair. They made her walk back and forth to ensure she had no deformities. One English lord was overheard commenting that she would ripen beautifully. She was 6 years old. The final deal was struck in the summer of 1396. France would provide 800,000 livres, an astronomical sum equal to nearly 2 years of English royal revenue. In exchange, Richard II would get Isabel, a 28-year truce, and the return of captured French territories. But they saved the cruelest detail for last. The marriage contract preserved in the English National Archives contains a clause that modern historians often skip over. It specifies that while the marriage would not be consummated until Isabel reached the proper age, Richard would have all other rights of a husband immediately. What were those rights? The right to control where she lived, what she learned, who she could see, the right to share her bed, because medieval nobility believed young brides should grow accustomed to their husband's presence, the right to absolute authority over every aspect of her existence. They signed away her childhood with the stroke of a quill. When they told Isabel she was going to be Queen of England, she asked a question that her governess later recorded in her private letters. "Will I be able to bring my dolls?" Think about that. A 6-year-old's first concern about becoming queen was whether she could keep her toys. Because that's what she was, a child who still played with dolls, who still needed help braiding her hair, who still cried when she scraped her knees. The French court threw itself into wedding preparations with obscene enthusiasm. Seamstresses worked day and night creating a trousseau fit for a queen. 12 wedding dresses, 40 ceremonial gowns, jewels that had belonged to 3 generations of French queens, all sized for a 6-year-old body. Isabeau of Bavaria personally oversaw the preparations, showing more interest in her daughter's wedding than she'd shown in her entire upbringing. Why? Because this was her triumph. She'd successfully traded a daughter for peace and profit. The court poets composed verses praising her wisdom. No one wrote verses for the little girl being packaged for export. October 1396. The farewell ceremony at the Louvre was a masterpiece of political theatre. Charles VI, in a rare moment of clarity, blessed his daughter with tears streaming down his face. Witnesses said he held her so tightly they had to pry his arms open. He whispered something in her ear that made her sob uncontrollably. We'll never know what a mad king said to his 6-year-old daughter in their last moment together. But servants reported that Isabel screamed for her father until her voice gave out, long after the palace had faded from view. The journey from Paris to Calais took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of a terrified child being carried further and further from everything she'd ever known. Her French attendants later testified that she barely ate, barely slept. She clutched a small wooden doll, her favourite, until her fingers bled from the pressure. At Calais, the handover took place like a hostage exchange, which, if we're honest, it was. The English delegation had built a massive tent city on the beach. Silk pavilions stretched as far as the eye could see, each flying Richard's personal standard. Musicians played, acrobats performed. It was a festival atmosphere, everyone celebrating except the 6-year-old prize at the centre of it all. The moment of transfer was precisely choreographed. French nobles walked Isabelle to the exact centre of a measured field. English nobles met them there. Words were spoken in Latin, words Isabelle didn't understand. Papers were signed, gold changed hands, and just like that she belonged to England. But what happened next is where the fairy tale version of history falls apart completely. The English escorts immediately separated Isabelle from her French attendants. Her governess, who'd raised her from birth, was sent back to France. Her ladies-in-waiting were replaced with English women who spoke a language she didn't understand. Even her little dog, the pet she'd been promised could accompany her, was taken away because Richard didn't like small dogs. They stripped away every familiar thing in her life in the span of an hour. The journey from Calais to London was a blur of strange faces and incomprehensible words. The English tried to make it festive. Every town they passed through was ordered to celebrate their new queen. But imagine being 6, exhausted, terrified, and having strangers scream at you in a foreign language while bells ring and crowds press in from all sides. Isabelle later told her confessor that she thought they were taking her to her execution. In her child's mind, all this ceremony could only mean death. She wasn't entirely wrong. London, November 1396. The city had never seen a spectacle like this. Richard II had spent a fortune he didn't have to impress his subjects and intimidate his enemies. Westminster Palace was draped in cloth of gold. The Thames was crowded with decorated barges. Every church bell in the city rang from dawn to midnight. St. Paul's Cathedral had been transformed into something from a fever dream. Thousands of candles, incense so thick it made eyes water, banners showing the joined arms of England and France, an altar covered in enough gold to buy a small army, and at the centre of it all, a 29-year-old man waiting to marry a 6-year-old child. Richard II cut an impressive figure, tall, elegant, with the refined features that court painters loved. He wore robes worth more than most nobles' entire estates. By all accounts, he was nervous, but not for the reasons you'd hope. See, Richard wasn't nervous about marrying a child. He was nervous about the politics. Would this buy him enough time to crush his domestic enemies? Would the French actually pay the full dowry? Would his nobles accept a queen who wouldn't be able to produce heirs for at least 6 more years? The moral implications? Those didn't seem to cross his mind. When they brought Isabelle into the cathedral, the crowd actually gasped. Not in admiration, in shock. She was so small. The ceremonial robes dragged behind her, requiring 2 attendants to carry the train. The crown, specially made for her child-sized head, still slipped constantly, requiring frequent adjustments. She was walked, or more accurately led like a prisoner down that impossibly long aisle. Hundreds of nobles watched. Ambassadors from across Europe took notes, and at the altar, her bridegroom waited with the patience of a spider. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony. He had to kneel to reach Isabelle's level. When he asked if she consented to the marriage, she didn't answer. She couldn't. Terror had stolen her voice. An English lady-in-waiting had to prompt her, whispering the required words until Isabelle repeated them in a voice so quiet only those nearest could hear. "I will." 2 words that sentenced her to a lifetime of captivity. When it came time for the rings, Richard's hands completely engulfed Isabelle's. Witnesses said she flinched when he touched her. The ring, despite being specially made for a child, still had to be forced onto her tiny finger. She winced, a small sound of pain in the vast cathedral. No one stopped the ceremony. The kiss of peace, a traditional part of medieval weddings, was modified. Richard kissed her forehead instead of her lips, the only merciful gesture in the entire grotesque performance. And then it was done. Isabelle of France was now Isabella of England, Queen Consort, wife to a man who could have been her father. The crowd cheered. Bells rang. Coins were thrown to the poor in celebration. Meanwhile, a 6-year-old girl stood at the altar, tears streaming down her face, wondering why everyone was so happy about the worst day of her life. The wedding feast was held at Westminster Hall. 2,000 guests ate courses that would have fed entire villages for months. Swans stuffed with peacock, boars' heads decorated with gold leaf, wines from across the known world. Entertainment included musicians, jesters, and a troupe of acrobats who performed death-defying stunts. Isabelle sat at the high table in a chair specially built to raise her to adult height. She didn't eat, couldn't eat. The Archbishop of York, seated nearby, later wrote that she spent the entire feast staring at a fixed point on the wall, as if her soul had departed and left only the shell. But the real horror was yet to come. Medieval wedding nights were public affairs, not the consummation. Even medieval society wasn't that depraved, but the bedding ceremony itself. The bride would be undressed by her ladies, blessed by priests and put to bed. The groom would join her, the curtains would be drawn, and the marriage would be considered complete. For Isabelle, they modified the tradition. She was put to bed in her shift, clutching the one French doll they'd allowed her to keep. Richard entered the chamber in his nightclothes. The courtiers watched as he climbed into bed with a 6-year-old child. The curtains were drawn, the courtiers left, and for the first time Isabelle was alone with her husband. What happened that night? We don't know. Richard later swore the marriage wasn't consummated, and there's no evidence to contradict him. But we do know that the next morning, Isabelle's ladies found her huddled in a corner of the massive bed, refusing to speak or move. She didn't speak for 3 days. When she finally did, her first words were in French, asking when she could go home. The answer, of course, was never. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Richard II, despite being part of this monstrous arrangement, seems to have treated Isabelle with surprising gentleness after the wedding. He set her up in her own household at Windsor Castle, surrounded by French-speaking attendants he'd specifically recruited. He visited regularly but maintained separate bedchambers. He showered her with gifts, not jewels or gowns, but toys and books and a small white pony she named Blanche. Was this kindness, or was this grooming? Historians still debate. What we know is that Isabelle slowly began to trust her husband. She learned English. She participated in court ceremonies. She even began to show affection for Richard, calling him "my Lord Uncle," a child's attempt to understand their relationship. Richard, for his part, seemed genuinely fond of her. He commissioned portraits where they're shown together, him seated, her standing beside him, her tiny hand resting on his arm. He wrote poems about innocence and protection. He violently punished anyone who showed the Queen disrespect. But don't mistake this for a redemption arc. A kind captor is still a captor, a gentle predator is still a predator, and a child bride treated well is still a child bride. Life at the English court settled into a bizarre routine. Isabelle attended state functions where she was displayed like an exotic pet. Foreign ambassadors would comment on how well trained she was, how she could already recite English poetry and perform complex court dances. I've got 3 more shocking revelations coming up about what happened to child brides in medieval courts, but before we continue, if you're finding this hidden history as disturbing as I did when I uncovered it, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. I release new investigations every week exposing the dark truths about historical figures, and trust me, Isabelle's story is just the beginning of what the history books don't want you to know. No one mentioned that she still played with dolls in private, that she still had nightmares that made her scream for a father an ocean away, that her ladies had to coax her to eat because she was wasting away from homesickness. The English nobles were divided in their treatment of her. Some, seeing which way the political winds blew, fawned over the child queen. Others, resentful of French influence and the massive dowry that had bankrupted the crown, treated her with barely concealed contempt. One incident, recorded by a chronicler but often omitted from sanitized histories, shows the daily horror of Isabelle's existence. During a state banquet, a drunk nobleman made a crude joke about when the queen would be ready for breeding. The hall erupted in laughter. Isabelle, not understanding the sexual implications but knowing she was being mocked, burst into tears and fled the table. Richard had the nobleman flogged nearly to death, but he didn't stop the culture that made such jokes possible. Meanwhile, back in France, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Charles VI's madness grew worse. Isabeau of Bavaria's corruptions grew bolder. The country spiraled towards civil war. The 800,000 livre dowry, meant to secure lasting peace, was spent within 2 years on Richard's lavish building projects and failed military campaigns. Isabelle received letters from home, heavily censored by English officials. She wrote back, letters that survive in fragments. "I pray for you all daily," one reads. "I am well treated, but my heart remains with France." Another more heartbreaking, "Do you still remember me? I fear you have forgotten your Isabelle." She was 7 years old, already worried about being forgotten. Then, in 1399, everything changed in the span of a few bloody months. Richard II's rule had grown increasingly tyrannical. He'd exiled or executed many of his nobles. He'd ruled without parliament. He'd spent money England didn't have on projects England didn't need. The final straw came when he seized the lands of Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster. Henry raised an army. Richard's support evaporated like morning mist. In August 1399, the king who'd married a child for power found himself a prisoner in his own kingdom. But think about what this meant for Isabelle. She woke up one morning as Queen of England. By nightfall, she was a 10-year-old widow. Richard was taken to Pontefract Castle where, months later, he would die under mysterious circumstances. Starved to death, some say. Murdered with an axe, say others. Isabelle wasn't allowed to see him, wasn't allowed to say goodbye. The last time she saw her husband, the man who'd been captor and protector, nightmare and only friend, he was being dragged away in chains while she screamed his name. Now she belonged to a new king who saw her not as a child to protect, but as a problem to solve. Henry IV faced a dilemma. Isabelle was still Queen of England in the eyes of the law. The French dowry had been spent. Sending her home meant returning money that no longer existed. Keeping her meant housing and feeding a living reminder of the previous regime. His solution was as cruel as it was practical. Isabelle became a prisoner at Havering Palace. Oh, they didn't call it imprisonment. She was an honoured guest who happened to be forbidden from leaving, from receiving uncensored letters, from having French visitors. For 3 years, she lived in gilded captivity. Think about that. From age 10 to 13, years when children should be learning, growing, playing, Isabelle was a political prisoner in a foreign country that had murdered the only person there who'd shown her kindness. The letters she wrote during this period are heartbreaking. Hidden in archives, dismissed by historians as unimportant, they reveal a child slowly losing hope. "I am forgotten by all," she wrote to an aunt. "I speak to the walls in French so I do not forget the sound. I dream of home but wake to prison." Another letter to her father. "They tell me you are ill again. I pray for your recovery. I pray you remember you have a daughter in England who loves you still." But the most devastating letter was never sent. Found hidden in her chambers after she finally left, it was addressed to Richard. "My lord, they say you are dead, but I do not believe it. You promised you would protect me always. I wait for you still. Your Isabelle." A 13-year-old girl waiting for a dead man to save her. That's what English politics had created. Henry IV tried various solutions to the Isabelle problem. First, he proposed she marry his son, the future Henry V. She refused with a vehemence that shocked the court. The quiet, compliant child queen had found her voice, and it said, "I am Richard's widow. I will marry no English prince." Imagine the courage that took. A 13-year-old girl, imprisoned and powerless, defying a king who'd already killed one monarch. Henry's next plan was crueler. If she wouldn't remarry, she'd remain in England indefinitely, a hostage to ensure French good behaviour. But Isabelle had learned from her years at court. She knew how to play the game. She smuggled letters to France through sympathetic servants. She feigned illness to gain access to French-speaking physicians who could carry messages. She used her status as Dowager Queen to demand certain privileges, then used those privileges to build a network of supporters. This wasn't a passive princess waiting for rescue. This was a teenager who'd survived 2 kings and was determined to survive a third. Finally, the French court, pressured by Isabelle's increasingly desperate letters and needing to save face, demanded her return. Negotiations dragged on for 2 more years. Henry wanted compensation for the dowry. France wanted compensation for Isabelle's imprisonment. Back and forth, while a girl's youth withered in captivity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Isabelle's mad father, Charles VI, had a moment of clarity. For one brief shining day, the fog lifted from his mind. He remembered he had a daughter in England. He remembered she'd been sold for peace, and he flew into a rage that terrified even his handlers. "Bring her home," he screamed, and for once the court listened to their mad king. In 1401, at age 13, Isabelle finally returned to France. But the girl who came back was not the child who'd left. Contemporary accounts describe her as aged beyond her years, marked by melancholy, and most tellingly, forever looking over her shoulder as if expecting capture. The reunion with her family was not the joyful homecoming she'd dreamed of for 5 years. Charles VI didn't recognise her. The madness had claimed him again by the time she arrived. Isabeau of Bavaria saw not a daughter, but a political asset that had depreciated in value. A used queen was worth less on the marriage market than a fresh princess. Still, Isabelle was home, French soil, French voices, French food. For a brief moment, she might have believed the nightmare was over. She was wrong. The nightmare was just changing shape. France in 1401 was even more chaotic than when she'd left. The Armagnac-Burgundian civil war had erupted in full. Paris changed hands regularly, each faction bloodier than the last. The Mad King was a puppet. The Queen Mother was openly allied with France's enemies. The treasury was empty. The people starved. And Isabelle? She was damaged goods in need of rehabilitation. Isabeau's solution was swift and mercenary. In 1406, she arranged Isabelle's marriage to Charles, Duke of Orleans. He was a poet, a dreamer, close to Isabelle in age and temperament. By all accounts, it was the first time in her life Isabelle experienced something approaching love. Charles was gentle where Richard had been possessive. He was young where Richard had been aging. He wrote her poetry that spoke of healing and hope. For a brief, beautiful moment, Isabelle knew happiness. They had a daughter, Jeanne, in 1409. Motherhood transformed Isabelle. Witnesses said she glowed with a joy they'd never seen before. She had someone to love who was truly hers, someone to protect as she'd never been protected. But this is Isabelle's story, and happiness was never meant to last. The birth was difficult, too difficult for a body that had been malnourished by depression, worn down by stress, aged by trauma. The physicians, the same ones who couldn't cure a mad king, couldn't save a dying queen. As Isabelle lay dying at age 20, she made one request. She wanted to hold her daughter one more time. They brought the infant Jeanne to her, and Isabelle whispered something in the baby's ear. No one heard what she said. Her last words were for her daughter alone. She died on September 13th, 1409, 20 years old, a queen twice over, a prisoner, a pawn, and finally, briefly, a mother who knew love. The court chroniclers spent exactly 3 lines on her death. 3 lines for a woman who'd been sold at 6, widowed at 10, imprisoned until 13, and dead at 20. 3 lines that focused on the political implications of her death, not the human tragedy of her life. But we know the truth now, hidden in archives, in private letters, in the margins of official histories where scribes sometimes told the truth. We know what was done to Isabelle of France. She was not a princess in a fairy tale. She was a child sacrificed on the altar of politics. Her suffering was not noble or meaningful. It was preventable cruelty dressed up in silk and called diplomacy. Every time we romanticize the medieval period, every time we sigh over knights and ladies and courtly love, we're erasing victims like Isabelle. Children who were bought and sold, women who were traded like livestock. Human beings whose entire existence was subordinated to the games of powerful men. The proof is overwhelming. The wedding contracts that specify ownership of a child. The financial records showing the price paid for a 6-year-old girl. The letters begging for freedom. The testimony of servants who saw her tears. The medical records of a body broken by a lifetime of trauma. This was not an anomaly. Isabelle's story was repeated hundreds of times across medieval Europe. Margaret of Anjou, married at 15. Philippa of England, betrothed at age 1. Countless girls whose names we don't even know because they weren't important enough to record. But Isabelle we remember, not because her story was unique, but because enough fragments survived for us to piece together the truth. She stands for all of them, all the children sacrificed for their parents' ambitions. When you see medieval romances on screen, remember Isabelle crying for her father as she was carried to England. When historians talk about the glory of chivalry, remember a 6-year-old asking if she could bring her dolls to her wedding. When people romanticize arranged marriages as different times, remember a 20-year-old dying from a body broken by a lifetime of being owned. Isabelle of France was murdered, not with a sword or poison, but with politics. Not in a day, but across 14 years of systematic destruction. Her childhood was murdered at 6. Her freedom was murdered at 10. Her hope was murdered at 13. And finally her body gave up at 20. She left behind a daughter who would grow up to face her own political marriage, her own reduction to currency in the games of powerful men. The cycle continued because that's what cycles do when no one stops them. But we can stop romanticising them. We can call them what they were: child abuse sanctioned by church and state, human trafficking dressed up in ceremony, the destruction of innocence in the name of power. The next time someone tells you about the romance of medieval times, tell them about Isabelle. Tell them about the 6-year-old bride who paid for peace with her childhood. Tell them about the letters begging to come home. Tell them about the 20-year-old who died never having lived a single day for herself. That's the real medieval period. That's the truth behind the castles and crowns. That's the horror we've spent centuries trying to forget. But Isabelle deserves to be remembered. Not as a queen, not as a political symbol, but as a child who should have been protected and wasn't. As a girl who should have been loved and was instead sold. As a woman who found love too late to save her. Her gravestone reads, Isabelle of Valois, Queen of England, Duchess of Orléans. It should read, Isabelle, victim of a world that saw children as property. She was 6 years old in a wedding dress that weighed more than she did, and nobody saved her. That's the horror that should haunt us, not ghosts or monsters or things that go bump in the night, but the real horror of real people doing unconscionable things and calling it civilization. Isabelle of France, remember her name, remember her story, and remember that the only thing necessary for such evil to flourish is for good people to look away and call it history. The little girl who asked if she could bring her dolls to her wedding deserves at least that much. If Isabelle's story shocked you, you need to see what happened to Catherine Howard, another child bride whose fate was even more horrifying. I've uncovered execution records that prove she wasn't the adulteress history claims. Subscribe for more suppressed historical truths, and I'll see you in the next investigation.